Let's take a look at making an animated accessory item using the toolkit. So as always, File, New, General. Just reset the scene in case anything's moved, and we're starting from the basics. And then we want View, Sidebar. That gives us a sidebar where we can see the toolkit panel. Click. And then for this, we want the attachment tool. So click on the label, and there we have the tool. And to add it, we just append attachment file. So click, and that drops in the initial skeleton. So this gives us the bones that we can use to make our attachment. So what we need to do here is, using the eyedropper or the bone list, we need to select a bone. So we're going to use the head for this. So all we need to do, eyedropper, click to select, the avatar will appear and it'll set the bone as the head. So we can switch between the male and female, or none, we can hide it. Just click the button. So we'll use the female. So what we're going to do is just make a very simple animated hairpiece. So let's just hide the avatar so that we can see what we're doing for the moment. And what we're going to do is move the 3D cursor, which is down at the avatar's feet at the moment by default, down here. We're going to move that to the head to save us some time when we add our mesh, because it'll add it where the cursor is. So select our armature object, and then we want Object, Snap, Cursor to Selected. Object, Snap, Cursor to Selected. That moves the cursor there. If we just enable 3D cursor as a pivot point, just to make this easier to see, and then enable Move widget, we can see where the cursor is located. So the cursor, or the 3D widget, moves with the cursor. So our object, Snap, Cursor to Selected. Next we add our mesh. So add mesh, and then we're just going to add a cylinder. That adds it to the scene, and it's very big at the moment, so we'll use the cylinder properties, and we'll just change this. We don't need it to be too complicated. Radius 0.25, length 2 meters, that'll do for now, and that's all we need. So what we're going to do, now that we've got our basic object in place, is we're going to position this relative to it being a simple ponytail accessory. So we'll position this where we need it to be. Let's just change the origin or pivot point back to what it was by default, which is the median point. So we just changed that for the purposes of showing where the cursor is, making it easier to see where that is. So you don't need to do that step, median point. Right, so let's do some basic editing. Don't need to do anything complicated, so object mode, edit mode. That'll change the mesh appearance, and then we can use the selection tools. We're in vertex, we've got edge, and then we've got face. So click on face, just to make this easier. Highlight, and then we can use the extrude tool to extrude some faces. Get the extrude tool, click drag the plus. Don't worry too much at the moment about the orientation of these, because we can change that. So that's all we need to do. Rotate widget. And what we can do here is we want this to be curved. So we're just going to do a loop select. So Alt, click, on any one of these faces and it'll select the loop. Let's just view frame selected, so we're rotating around our selection. And then all we need to do is just do some basic manipulation. We don't have to worry about this right now because it'll change as we move our object into place. So drop that into the head, edge select, going to do a loop select again, but this time of an edge. So Alt, click, that selects the loop. And then use our tools. Same again. So just doing some basic editing. And that is all we need for the moment, because all we're doing is basically showing the principles and the process. So that will be a very crude ponytail. So let's exit edit mode back into object mode. Let's just enable wireframe. So we're in object properties. We want viewport display, and then just enable wireframe so we can see the wireframe. So if we deselect, we can see the structure of the mesh. So this just makes it easier to see what we're doing as we work. So let's just save this file, save as, choose our location, Toolkit animated hair 1, save as. So that's our basic mesh. What we need to do next, because we need to create an armature or a skeleton that will allow us to articulate these mesh sections, we need the root armature that's associated with the accessory. It's not the armature that we can currently see in the scene. It's not this armature named head. This just gives us a visual representation of the actual armature that forms the basis of the accessory. So what we have to do to get that skeleton or that armature is select our mesh. So we've already set the bone that we're going to be using. What we need to do, select our mesh, and then what we do is click Setup Mesh. And when we do this, what the toolkit will do is add the actual accessory skeleton that we need. And it'll drop it into place where the head bone is. We're using the head bone at the moment, but it could be any other bone, it doesn't really matter. So mesh select, click Setup Mesh. It dropped in attachment root, attachment node, head. So if we hide the head armature, see if we can find it in here. There it is, head armature. We can hide that, and that leaves us with the actual skeleton that we need for this. And that's called attachment rig. So that in the outliner is all the way down here in the attachment export collection. So this is the actual armature that we need to use to create our skeleton to animate our mesh. So once setup mesh has been done, the attachment rig has been added to the scene, hide the actual armature that we use to set the bone object or bone parent, just hide that, and it'll give us access to attachment. That's what we need. So with this, we can now create our rig. So select our armature, object mode, edit mode. This lets us into edit mode, where we can select the bones of our armature. So to make the rig, we can duplicate an existing bone. So we select a bone and just duplicate it. So armature, duplicate. That creates a copy of the bone. So press escape to release. Move it to the start of the ponytail using the move or transform widget. Then position the bone so it's inside the mesh. So let's just object mode. Let's make the mesh display as a wireframe so that we can see it. So we're in object properties, wire, so we can see the mesh inside. We could use X-ray as well, but we'll just do this for now. Back into edit mode. View, to make this easier, viewpoint, right. And then what we can do is click select on the nodes to position the bone, and then to create a new bone, extrude. So click, we'll get the extrude tool. We can click drag anywhere inside the white loop to extrude in a particular direction rather than the direction of the tool itself. And all we need to do is just drag, position, so that's a very big bone, extrude down to the bottom. So that's our bone chain. So that's our armature. So let's save this. Exit edit mode, back into object mode. File, save as 2. So now that we've got this, we need to weight paint the mesh to our armature. So first, select the mesh, modifiers, we need to just double check it does have an armature and it is associated with the rig, so the attachment rig, so that's okay. What we need to do next is check object data properties for a vertex group. So we've got a vertex group here. So that means because we use setup mesh, that means the mesh is already set up and ready for weight painting. But at the moment, the entire mesh is weight painted to just this bone. And we'll see that when we go into weight paint mode. So armature, shift click mesh, and then switch the mode to weight paint. So we're in object at the moment, we want weight paint. We can now click on individual bones and weight paint. But to aid the process, we need to switch the mesh back into textured mode so that we can see it. So display as textured. So armature, mesh, weight paint. So we can see, selecting the attachment bones, it highlights the entire mesh red. So that means that the entire thing is linked to the bone that we're moving. We need to change that, so we're going to do some weight painting. So click a bone and just paint. So we've got the tool set to weight 1, which will be red, and the strength, which is full. We want to weight paint each of these segments to one bone. And as we do this, in Object Data Properties, we'll see additional groups appearing. That's what we want. So this section of the mesh is associated with the bone that's inside here. This section of the mesh will be associated with this bone, and so on. And there will be some shared or sharing across certain vertex or edge loops. So this edge loop is shared between this bone and this bone. So we've got another group. Another one. And then finally, the top bone. But we want to make sure that this section doesn't move, in this particular example being a hair accessory. So this is latched onto the head, so this shouldn't move. So that's going to be associated with the initial bone of the armature. So if we drop out of weight paint mode back into object mode, select our armature, switch to pose mode, we can test the articulation of our mesh. And we can see that's a slight problem. Our mesh should be positioned so the bones are inside it. So that means that there's another bone influencing this mesh, and that's likely going to be the initial bone. So if we press escape just to release that, back into object mode, and we can test that or check that. Weight paint mode, shift click the mesh, weight paint. So that's red. So if we select attachment node head, it's making the entire mesh go red. So that's an influence over the other sections of the mesh which we don't want. So we have to clear this. So we have the bone selected. We can set the weight value to 0, which cancels or nulls the influence. Strength 1, and then we can paint that to get rid of it. So we don't want that group. So this is the group that we've got active at the moment. We don't want that associated with any section of the mesh other than this front face. So we can do it this way. Or switch out of weight paint, go back into object mode. Alternatively, select the mesh, edit mode, then in object data properties and vertex groups, highlight the group, then use the select button and check what's active or what highlights. So we can go into vertex select for this to make it easier to see. So even though we've weight painted 0, so we've nulled the values, the color values, it's still part of that group. So what we need to do is address this so we can select our front face and then invert this selection. So select invert, so that will select everything but the one that we want. And then in the vertex group selection we can click remove. So if we now select none, we can then test that now only selects this front face. And that's what we want. So if we now go back into object mode, select our armature, switch to pose mode, we should now find that if we press the R key just to rotate, that's just moving that section of the mesh. So we can go through the bone chain, and now we find the mesh articulates correctly relative to what we were expecting. And that is the mesh rigged to the armature. So that's the second step. So let's save this. Object mode. 3. And one last step before we actually do any animation. So select the armature, pose mode. Let's just go into X-ray for the moment. Select our bottom bone, and then in bone constraints, what we can do here is add bone constraint, inverse kinematics. What this does is it adds a kinematic control to the bone chain. So if we now move, so press the G key, we now have one bone controlling our entire chain. So right now we don't have a connection between these two bones, which we do need to set up. So at the moment all it's doing is controlling the active chain. And what we can do is set that to using just these 4 bones, because if we leave it in the default, in chain length, when we link these 2 bones together, the link will go to this bone, which we want to avoid. So let's set that to 4. 1, that's the bone itself. 2, that's the next bone up. 3, next bone up again. And then 4, that's the final bone in the chain that we want. So pose mode, edit mode. We need to create a relationship between the bones, these 2. So select the first bone, and then we want to go into bone properties, relations, parent, and then we'll see a list. So that's bone properties, parent, and then look at the list. And what we want is attachment node head, or we can use attachment root. Either one will work. So we get this relationship line appearing, confirming the change. So if we go back into pose mode, check our bone chain, we can see that it's still moving, but the other bones control the entire rig. So with that, we've basically rigged the mesh. So we've created our mesh, rigged it to the bones so that it articulates at the joints, added the IK constraint, linked the bones together. So root controls everything. So now Let's just save this again, and then we can do a quick animation. There's quite a bit of work involved in setting up the rig so that it articulates correctly and for it to load in IMVU. But once we've got all of this done, the next step is relatively straightforward. So let's go back into texture mode. Now to animate, we want to change the timeline. So timeline, dope sheet. That'll change the appearance. So if we click on this border, if we mouse over, we get a double-headed arrow, click drag, and that just drags and increases the space that we're using. So we want to change dope sheet to action editor. We must do this for all sequences and animations for IMVU. So action editor, because this is what we actually use to create the animations. So we're still in pose mode. We can select our bottom bone. So let's switch on X-ray so that we can see. And all we need to do is just pose the bone. So we can use the widgets and just click drag, and it'll drag the entire chain and the bones. So select the chain. So we've just positioned it. Select the chain, so shift click. We need to do this. We need to make sure that the bones are set. So if you're moving particular bones, shift click, or if we want to set a pose for all bones, select all. And then from pose, animation, insert keyframe. So pose, animation, insert keyframe. And the shortcut key is I. So insert frame, and what we want from this is location and rotation. That will drop in a keyframe marker. We can expand the summary, and that will show all the bones that we've marked. And then we can turn show selected off. So when we select an individual bone, we're still seeing all the others. If that's enabled, it will only show the selected. So disable that. So let's move the timeline scrubber to frame 30. Create another position. Same again, select all, pose, animation, insert keyframe, location, rotation. And then for the return, so we want this to loop, what we can do is go back to frame 1, make sure everything is selected. Then from the pose menu, we can use copy pose. Copy pose, move the scrubber to frame 60, pose, paste pose. That pastes the pose, but it doesn't drop in the keyframes, so we have to do that manually again. So pose, animation, insert keyframe, location and rotation. So there is our sequence. So if we play this back, you can see the sequence. So what we may need to do is two things. Change the length. By default it's 250 frames. At the moment we've got 60, so we can do two things here. If we want to decrease the speed of the animation, we can increase the sequence length. So we move this keyframe 60 to 120, for example. So we can do that with an Alt click. So we're selecting the entire keyframe that's associated with each channel. So this one frame has multiple channels. All we need to do is press the G key and move that to 120. Same again for 30. Move that to 60. So what we've done is slowed the sequence down by increasing its length. So to make this loop correctly, in terms of playback, what we want to do is adjust the sequence length that's marked in Blender from 250 to 120. So for that, we want to be in Output Properties, and we have some sequence options here. So end 250 is this point. We want to change that to 120. So all we need to do is click, type 120. That changes the highlighted area from 250 to 120 as we want. So now, if we play the sequence, it'll play just 120 frames and it'll loop. So for playback purposes, this is a preview of what it'll do in IMVU. So the next thing is we want to change the frame rate. So at the moment it's 24. Click, select 30. That's what IMVU uses. So frame rate 30. You might see an increase in speed because we're using a few more frames per second. But that is a replication of what we'll see in IMVU. So we're right about ready to export. So let's just save this file, save as number 5. Let's show the avatar, disable X-ray. So this is more or less what we're going to see in Studio. All we need to do next, now that we've got our animation, as simple as it is, all we need to do, pose mode, back into object mode, make sure nothing is selected, and then just click the export button in the toolkit. So click, and that generates the FBX that we need that we can now import in Studio. So in IMVU Studio, we want to create a new project. We want the empty female accessory or the empty male accessory, depending on what we're doing, but we want the female in this instance. So female, select, then derive. This opens the default avatar. All we need to do is import our FBX. So import FBX, browse to and select our file, Accessories, Blender, Toolkit, Animated Hair, and just click Open. We'll then get a preview of what's in the file. Setup FBX. We don't need to change the scale, that can remain as is. We want 8 bones, 1 mesh, so attachment root. We can give it an arbitrary mesh ID if we want, optional. Next. It's got our material. We'll come back to this in a moment once we've tested. Next, once we've tested the import, review, import. So there is our imported mesh. So for the animation, component, actions, new action. So we want this playing all the time, so stance.on idle, uppercase I, it's case sensitive. New ensemble. In the asset, we have our sequence. Set the duration, start frame 1, end frame 120, infinite number of loops, replace, everything else is okay, apply, and then preview, and we should see our animation. And there it is. So that is our animated accessory. And now that we know that that works, we can go back into Blender and unwrap and give our object a material. So back in Blender, select our mesh. Now that we know everything works, assign a material if one is not assigned already. So let's check material properties. There isn't one. So click on new, add new material. We'll call this ponytail. 0, square brackets 0. Everything else is okay. So next we want to be in shading workspace. See our object, and in the node editor in the bottom we want to add texture, image texture. Click to drop that in place, and what we can do is connect color output to base color input. It'll go black because we haven't set an image yet. So for that, either load one, or if we don't have one, click new. We'll get the new image pop up where we can create our image. Let's just call this ponytail. Set the width to 5.6, height 512, and then the generated type is currently set to blank, which is this color, black, which is why the mesh appears black. So if we wanted to, we could change the color, and it won't do it just yet because we haven't okayed this, but this would change to this pinky color. But generated type, UV grid or color grid, and OK, and there is our image. So the UV mapping is a little bit wonky because it's using the default which we've manipulated and edited. So the object, when we dropped it into the scene, had a default UV map assignment. As we've edited the mesh, that's distorted, so we need to edit that. So we go into UV editing workspace, zoom into our mesh, toggle the view to material preview so we can see the actual image, select all so that we can see the UV map. So it automatically toggles us into edit mode. So select all so we can see the UV map. And all we need to do is a little bit of editing. We might need to sort this out a little bit because we extruded the edges, which basically smudges or blurs the UV map because it's using a collapsed UV across a larger area of the mesh. So if we deselect none, so if we switch to face select, then alt click, we can see that the corresponding UVs for this section of the mesh is this. So it squashed or collapsed the UVs because of the way the mesh was created, because we extruded. So we have to unwrap our object properly. And for an object like this, all we need to do is add a seam down the inside edge all the way up to the top, which will allow us to split the UV so that we can map it properly. So edge select, alt click on this edge, that will select the loop all the way up to the top. Then from here, we want the edge menu and then mark seam. That highlights that edge, so that edge loop. So what this will do is it'll split the UV so that it unwraps as a single patch. Whilst we're here, face select, we can delete these two faces, the top and the bottom, which closes the cylinder, but with this particular type of object we don't necessarily need it. So we can either delete it, or we can also select those sections, the loops. So we're in edge select again, and alt click edge, mark seam. So what this will do is it'll isolate these two sections like they are currently within the UV map. So we can either do that or delete them outright because they're not needed. So select all and then unwrap. So we can either do that from the UV menu in the editor or the UV menu in the 3D view. Either or, it doesn't really matter, do the same thing. So UV, unwrap. So that unwraps our mesh. So let's have a look. So if we undo that, so that's what it was before, and then we'll redo, that's what it is after. Obviously we've got a big armature in the way, so let's just hide that for the moment. So undo, 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 undo. Let's hide. Now redo. So let's just redo the UV map. So edit mode, select all, unwrap. So that's our UV map and the distribution. So we could leave this as is with the default unwrap that we've done, but the layout isn't particularly conducive to hair. To fix that, we need to edit the individual UV vertices so that they fit within the bounds of the image. So we need to do a bit of UV editing. So we are in vertex select, and we would use the widgets to select individual vertices, just drag them into position like so. We do this for the entire mesh, and as we do it, it alters the mapping of the UV. So the seam is round the back, so we can't quite see it. So let's use the outliner, hide the mesh, so that's the UV. So we might as well do a quick rough unwrap. So what we're doing is sorting out the distribution of the UVs on our image. So that's click drag. And that's what you would end up with. So let's just switch to island. So that's the UV mapped to the bounds roughly. Obviously spend a bit more time doing that, but that's the bounds of the image mapped one-to-one to our mesh. We don't have to worry about these two because, as we said before, they are not used. So we can either map them and just push them into a corner, it doesn't matter where they are, or we can delete them. So that's our object given a material. So it's basic material, we don't need to do anything else. And UV unwrapped. So back into layout workspace. Unhide all the bits that we hid. There we go. So now we can hide them and show them. So if you hide objects from within the outliner, remember to re-enable them in order for the tool to then use the buttons. So now that we've got that, make sure we're in object mode, save the file, number 6, and then we can do our final export. So select none, and then export. So that's created an FBX, which we can now again import into Studio. So that's what we had before. So let's create a new project. Empty female accessory. Derive. There's the project. So import FBX. Find the file. Animated 6. And then just open. So if it has trouble importing, so it's not doing anything, cancel out and go back into Blender. So back in Blender, what we want to do is convert this image from a generated image, so it's temporary data at the moment, and we want to convert it to an actual bitmap. So UV editing. So there's the image that we mapped. So from the image menu, we want image, save as, or save the image. File format, want a lossless, which will help with editing if we need to. So toggle raw, file location, file name, save as. Switch to shading workspace. Make sure our mesh is selected. Click on the folder icon and just double check that we are using the image that we just saved. There it is, ponytail TGA. There it is, ponytail TGA. Just open image. That'll drop it in and it'll ensure that we are using the right image. So there's our image. Back to layout. Save the file. So select none and then export again. So we have to do this because IMVU doesn't like the temporary image data that's generated when we create these image textures. So when we went through that process to create an image that we can map to the object, it's virtual generated temporary image that isn't exported and converted when we export the file. So we have to convert that data into an actual image by saving it, which then can be reassociated with our material. It should do it automatically, but if it doesn't, just click on the folder icon and load the image in, which then means we can export. So export again, that's created number 7. So again, in Studio, we can import the file now. So there's our project. Import FBX. Find the file. Open. So it's brought in the FBX this time. So setup FBX. That's okay. That's okay. Attachment root. We don't need to change the mesh ID. So next. It's brought in our image now. So ponytail. Next. All the animations. It's duplicated that for each bone, but that's okay. Review. Import. And it automatically assembles the mesh and the material. So all we need to do is go to component, as we did before, actions, create a new action. Again, starts.idle, because we want this to play all the time, in its case sensitive. New ensemble, asset. There's our sequence. Set the frame range 1 to 120. Number of times it loops 0 for infinite. Replace. Everything else is okay. Apply. And then preview. And there is our animated accessory item. Of course, all you would need to do now is save the project. File, save as. And then upload to the catalogue. But that is how you create an animated accessory using the toolkit.